He thought he was done with missions, done with waiting, done with listening for signals no one else could hear. But somewhere in the mountains, far from maps and memories, a retired Navy SEAL followed his dog into a place that refused to be forgotten. What they found was not abandoned, not broken, and not accidental. It was built to endure and to wait. As the storm closed in, the silence spoke louder than gunfire ever had, and instinct became the only compass left. This is not a story about war, but about stillness, faith, and the quiet bond between a man and his German shepherd. It's about learning that some paths are not meant to be crossed quickly. They are meant to be honored. If you believe stories like this matter, please like this video, subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts, and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Caleb Ward lived on the edge of places, the way some men lived on the edge of sleep. Not homeless, not settled, not lost in the dramatic sense, but quietly unmoored, drifting between towns that did not ask questions and jobs that did not require commitment. He rented rooms by the month, sometimes by the week, choosing locations that sat just far enough from highways to avoid noise, yet close enough to civilization that survival did not demand explanation. At 40, he had learned how to exist without belonging, how to move through spaces without leaving an impression, how to keep his life light enough to carry without complaint. He worked when he needed to, usually with his hands. Short contracts, security consulting for rural properties, occasional instruction gigs that drew on skills most people preferred not to think about. He did the work competently, quietly, and left before familiarity could grow. The money was enough. More than enough, really. But he had learned long ago that excess invited questions, and questions led to attachments. He preferred things simple, measurable, finite. At night, however, simplicity abandoned him. The memories did not arrive as scenes or images. There were no clear faces, no replayed firefights, no cinematic echoes of explosions. What came instead were sensations. The pressure of silence stretched too long. The weight of decisions that could not be revised. The faint tightening in his chest when a room felt too still, or when a sound failed to arrive where one should have. His body remembered things his mind had learned to set aside. It was not fear. Fear had edges. This was something duller, more persistent, a reminder that survival was not the same as resolution. Hawk was always there. The German Shepherd was 6, maybe 7. His exact age lost somewhere between deployments and transfers. He was large without being bulky, his frame long and balanced, his movements economical. His coat was thick and close, black across his back and shoulders, fading into deep tan along his legs and chest. His ears stood high and alert even at rest, and his eyes, dark, steady, observant, missed very little. Hawk did not crowd Caleb or demand attention. He did not whine or pace when the nights grew long. He simply remained, a solid presence at the edge of the room, breathing slow and even, as if reminding the world that at least one thing was stable. Their bond was not sentimental. It had been forged in repetition, in shared routines, and unspoken understanding. Hawk knew Caleb's moods not by expression, but by posture. Caleb, in turn, trusted the dog's instincts without needing to justify them. It was the kind of relationship common among those who had lived under rules where trust was not optional and mistakes carried weight. On the morning the letter arrived, Caleb was staying in a small desert town whose name he had already begun to forget. The post office sat between a closed diner and a hardware store that sold more dust than nails. The clerk slid the envelope across the counter without comment. It was cream-colored, unadorned, the address written in a steady hand he recognized immediately. Margaret Rowan. Maggie. Caleb did not open the letter right away. He stood outside, the envelope light in his hand, feeling its weight in a way that had nothing to do with paper. Maggie had been there when he came back broken in ways the military paperwork could not categorize. She was not family, not officially. Just a woman with silver hair always pulled back into a loose knot, skin weathered from years outdoors, and eyes sharp enough to notice when a man was pretending he was fine. She had never pushed him to talk. She had never asked him to stay. She had simply made space and trusted him to decide whether to occupy it. He sat on the low concrete step and tore the envelope open. The letter was short. No greeting, no explanation. If you still intend to come back, now is the time. That was all. No signature. None was needed. Caleb read the sentence twice, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He did not know what it meant. Maggie had never been dramatic. She disliked urgency, distrusted emotional leverage. If she had written this, it was not to provoke panic or guilt. It was an observation, a statement of fact, something she believed to be true. He exhaled slowly and stared out at the street, watching heat shimmer above the pavement. Behind him, Hawk rose to his feet. The sound was subtle, just the shift of weight, the quiet click of nails against concrete. Caleb turned instinctively. Hawk stood facing the door of the post office, body angled, ears forward, attention fixed. He was not agitated, not alert in the sense of danger. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or alignment. "You ready?" Caleb asked quietly, more to himself than the dog. Hawk did not move, but his tail lifted slightly, the tip curving once before settling. Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came when a choice had already been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought. They left town that afternoon. The road stretched long and pale beneath a sky that held no promises. Caleb drove without hurry, following routes that grew narrower the farther he went, the land flattening into wide, open silence. Hawk lay in the back, head up, eyes tracking the horizon through the side window. Occasionally he shifted, nose lifting as if testing the air even at speed. Caleb noticed, as he always did, but did not comment. He had learned when to ask questions and when to let things unfold. As the sun dipped lower, they turned onto a secondary road marked only by a leaning sign and a faded number. The terrain changed subtly. Red stone replaced scrub. The wind carried a different texture, cooler, sharper. Caleb slowed, scanning the landscape with the same practiced awareness that had once kept him alive. Nothing stood out. That, in itself, registered faintly. They stopped near an old pull-off as dusk settled, the light thinning into long shadows. Caleb moved through his routine efficiently, setting up a simple camp. Hawk circled once, then sat, gaze fixed on a line of low hills to the west. He did not relax, did not lie down. Caleb noticed. Halfway through preparing a meal, Hawk rose again and moved several paces away, nose low, tracing an invisible path in the dirt. He paused, then turned back, meeting Caleb's eyes. There was no urgency in his posture, no demand, just an insistence that something had shifted. Caleb stood slowly, heart rate ticking up not in alarm, but in recognition. He scanned the area, listening. The air felt heavier. The wind had dropped abruptly, as if the land itself were holding its breath. "All right," Caleb murmured. Hawk stepped closer, then stopped, ears angling toward the west again. It passed within minutes. A distant rumble, barely audible. A faint change in the quality of light. Enough to register, not enough to explain. When it was over, the stillness returned, slightly altered, like a room after someone has left. Caleb finished the meal in silence. Hawk ate, then lay down, but not before glancing once more toward the hills. That night, Caleb slept lightly. Not from fear, but from awareness. The kind that did not fade with time, only learned to rest in shallow cycles. Hawk remained near the tent opening, body angled outward, breathing slow. When dawn came, pale and quiet, Caleb woke with the sense that something had begun moving, whether he understood it yet or not. They broke camp early. As they loaded the truck, Caleb's hand brushed the folded letter in his pocket. He paused, fingers lingering, then closed his jacket. He did not know what awaited him. He did not know why Maggie had written. He only knew that the life he had been living, carefully pared down, deliberately incomplete, had quietly reached its limit. Hawk jumped into the back without hesitation and settled. Eyes forward, Caleb started the engine and turned toward the road that would carry them deeper into the land, away from the edges he had learned to inhabit. He still did not understand the message, but Hawk did. And that, Caleb had learned, was often enough. The road Caleb chose that morning did not announce itself as unusual. It peeled away from the main highway in a slow, unremarkable curve, marked only by a weather-bleached sign, whose numbers had lost their edges to sun and sand. Beyond it stretched the red stone plateau, broad, exposed, indifferent. This was land that did not remember men for long. Tracks faded quickly here. History eroded the way footprints did, smoothed away by wind until only the shape of the ground remained. Caleb drove steadily, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, posture relaxed but alert. Years of habit shaped how he sat, how his eyes moved between mirrors, horizon, and road surface. He trusted landscapes like this more than forests. Here, danger rarely hid. It approached openly, announced by weather, terrain, or distance. You could read it if you knew how. Hawk rode in the back, upright, despite the vibration of the road. His head remained angled toward the open rear window, nose lifting now and then as the air shifted. The German shepherd's coat caught the light in sharp contrast. Black along the spine, tawny along the ribs, his muscles moving smoothly beneath it. He was quiet, but not still in the way of sleep. His attention tracked something beyond the truck, something moving with the wind rather than against it. The route had once been used decades earlier, a narrow supply corridor during the Cold War, carved not for beauty but for necessity. It no longer appeared on modern maps, at least not clearly. Caleb remembered it from a declassified briefing long ago, a footnote in a larger story. Forgotten infrastructure fascinated him, not because of nostalgia, but because such places revealed what people once believed was worth preparing for. He pulled off near a shallow rise as the afternoon light began to flatten. The plan was simple: set camp, eat, rest. The next morning, continue toward Maggie's place. Nothing in the forecast suggested trouble. Hawk jumped down from the truck and immediately slowed, paws pressing into the gravel as if testing its texture. He took several steps forward, then stopped. His ears rotated, not sharply, but with measured precision. He turned his head to the left, nose lifting into the wind, inhaling deeply. Not once, several times. Caleb noticed. "What is it?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Hawk did not look back. He took a few steps, then halted again, gaze fixed on a shallow cut between two rock faces. According to Caleb's recollection, the path ran straight through there. The map he had studied confirmed it. There was no reason to avoid it. The wind shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle change in direction, enough to alter how sound traveled. Hawk stiffened, his tail lowered slightly, not tucked, but no longer relaxed. He moved forward, then veered away from the cut, choosing a longer arc that curved along the base of the ridge. Caleb frowned. He stepped closer to the opening between the rocks. The air there felt different, cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang that did not belong to stone alone. He breathed in, slower this time, letting memory do what instinct could not. Ash, maybe. Old, cold. Not recent fire, but something that had burned long enough to leave residue in the ground. He looked back at Hawk. "You're sure?" he murmured. Hawk did not hesitate. He continued along the outer path, head low, movements controlled, not fearful, purposeful. Caleb hesitated only a moment before following. They had gone less than a mile when the sky began to change. The blue thinned, the light dulling as if a veil had been drawn across it. The horizon blurred, no longer sharply defined. Wind swept low across the ground, carrying grit that hissed against rock and metal. Caleb checked the dashboard, then the sky again. This was wrong. There had been no warning, no gradual buildup. The first gust hit hard enough to rock the truck. Caleb slowed instinctively, gripping the wheel as visibility dropped in uneven pulses. Sand skittered across the road, then lifted, swirling into dense sheets that moved like living things. The smell intensified. Metal, ash, something bitter underneath. Hawk braced himself, paws wide, body angled to compensate. He let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a growl. Something between. A signal. Caleb pulled the truck to a stop as the wind howled louder, hammering against the doors. The world beyond the windshield vanished into rust-colored chaos. This wasn't on the schedule, Caleb muttered. Hawk moved closer to the door, pressing his weight against it, as if to anchor the vehicle. His eyes never left the direction they had been traveling, though nothing could be seen there now. For several long minutes, they waited. The storm did not intensify further, but it did not pass. It hung over the land, relentless, grinding. Caleb felt the familiar assessment process take over. Options, risks, margins. Staying put carried danger. Moving blindly carried more. Then Hawk did something unexpected. He turned away from the windshield and looked directly at Caleb. Not at his hands, not at the window, at his face. The dog's gaze was steady, intent. He stepped back, then angled himself toward the side of the truck, toward the terrain Hawk had chosen earlier. He pawed once at the door, then again. Caleb stared at him, pulse ticking faster now, not from fear, but from recognition. Hawk was not reacting to the storm. He was responding to something beneath it. "You think it's worse ahead," Caleb said softly. Hawk's ears flicked. He pawed the door once more, then sat, posture firm. That was the moment Caleb felt it. The quiet shift inside, the same one he had felt reading Maggie's letter. The sense that the safest choice was not the most obvious one. Caleb turned the wheel and eased the truck off the main track, following the curve Hawk had indicated earlier. The ground here was rougher, uneven, forcing him to slow. Rocks scraped beneath the tires. The storm followed, but its force lessened as the terrain rose and folded around them. The wind lost its clean lines, breaking into confused eddies that battered and then released. After another half-mile, the storm receded almost abruptly. The air stilled, heavy and warm by comparison. The sand fell away in quiet sheets, settling into the cracks and depressions of the land. Caleb stopped the truck. They stepped out into the aftermath, the silence ringing in his ears. The sky remained muted, but the immediate danger had passed. Hawk shook once, sand flying from his coat, then moved forward to survey the area. His posture loosened slightly. Though his attention remained sharp, Caleb scanned the surroundings. The path they had avoided was no longer visible from here, swallowed entirely by the storm's remnants. The route Hawk had chosen led into a narrow basin, sheltered by stone on three sides. The air smelled cleaner here, stripped of ash and metal. "Good call," Caleb said quietly. Hawk glanced back, tongue lolling briefly before he resumed his watch. They made camp as the light faded, the storm now only a distant presence on the horizon. Caleb worked methodically, movements economical, conserving energy. As he set the last piece of gear in place, he realized something had changed. Not outside, but inside himself. The tension he carried so habitually had eased, just a fraction. That night, As the stars emerged one by one, Caleb sat with his back against the truck, Hawk at his side. The land stretched out around them, vast and unbothered. Somewhere ahead lay Maggie, and whatever had prompted her letter. Somewhere behind, a road that no longer mattered. Caleb reached into his jacket and touched the folded paper once more, then let his hand fall away. He did not know what waited for him, but he knew now that the path forward would not be marked by signs or maps. It would be read in wind, in instinct, and in the quiet decisions made when no one was watching. They found it just before the light began to thin. The basin Hawk had led them into narrowed gradually, the stone walls rising higher on either side, as if the land itself were drawing inward. The wind that had harried them all afternoon lost its strength here, breaking apart against the rock and falling silent. Caleb noticed the change immediately. His shoulders loosened a fraction, the constant calculation in his mind easing as the environment shifted from exposed to contained. Hawk slowed. The German shepherd moved ahead with unusual care, each step measured, nose low but not pressed to the ground. His ears stood tall, angled forward, not in alarm but in focused attention. He did not range outward the way he usually did when scouting unfamiliar terrain. Instead, he stayed close to a line only he seemed able to see, his body aligned with the curve of the basin. Caleb followed, eyes scanning the rock faces, the ground, the spaces where shadow pooled unnaturally. At first, there was nothing, just stone, sand, and the low scrub that clung stubbornly to life. Then Hawk stopped so abruptly that Caleb nearly collided with him. It took a moment for Caleb to see it. The structure sat low against the stone, its outline broken by decades of dust and wind-blown grit. From a distance, it looked less like a building and more like a natural rise, a mistake the land had decided not to correct. Only when the light shifted did the straight lines reveal themselves, edges too deliberate, angles too intentional to be the work of erosion. A stone cabin, not tall, not imposing, built wide and low, its roof sloping just enough to shed weather without catching the wind. The walls were made of local rock, stacked and fitted with care, each piece chosen for shape as much as size. There was no visible path leading to it, no sign of regular approach. It had not been meant to be found easily. Caleb stopped several yards away, instinctively taking in the details. The entrance faced away from the basin's mouth, angled so that any prevailing wind would slide past rather than drive inward. A thick wooden door sat recessed within the stone, its surface scarred by time but not warped. Iron hinges, dulled to a dark mat, held firm. Whoever had built this had known the land and had listened to it. Hawk stood perfectly still. His posture was alert but calm. His tail hung neutral, ears forward, eyes fixed on the door. He did not bark, did not growl. He simply waited, as if standing before something that required acknowledgement rather than challenge. Caleb felt a prickle along his arms, the familiar sensation that came when logic alone was no longer sufficient. "You've found it," Caleb murmured, though he wasn't sure what he meant by it. He approached slowly, boots crunching softly against the gravel. The air here felt different, still, dense, carrying the faint scent of old ash and dry stone. Not abandonment, preservation. The kind that came from things being left alone long enough to settle into themselves. Caleb placed his hand against the door. The wood was cool, solid beneath his palm. He tested the handle gently, half expecting resistance, but the latch moved smoothly, as if it had been used not long ago. The door opened with a low creak, restrained rather than loud, the sound absorbed by the stone walls. Inside, the light dimmed immediately. Caleb paused, letting his eyes adjust. Hawk stepped forward without hesitation, crossing the threshold as if he had already decided the space was safe. That alone told Caleb more than any scan of corners or angles could. The interior was compact, but not cramped. Every inch had been considered. A stone stove sat slightly off-center, its placement clearly deliberate. positioned to distribute heat evenly without obstructing movement. The flue angled upward through the ceiling, its exit point carefully sealed where it met the roof. The walls were smooth in places, the result of years of hands brushing past them, of maintenance rather than neglect. Along the stone near the stove, markings caught Caleb's eye. They were carved shallowly into the rock, weathered but legible. Lines, symbols, numbers. At first glance, they seemed random, but as Caleb stepped closer, the pattern emerged. Wind directions, marked with arrows. Temperature ranges etched beside shallow grooves. Notes about storms, where they came from, how they shifted, where the pressure dropped fastest. This was not decoration. This was data. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, a quiet recognition that had nothing to do with sentiment. Whoever had built this place had thought the way Caleb thought when planning an operation, anticipating variables, accounting for failure, leaving nothing to chance that could be measured. "This wasn't a hideout," Caleb said softly. Hawk glanced back at him, then returned his attention to the room, moving slowly, sniffing along the base of the walls. He paused near the stove, then circled once before sitting, posture relaxed but attentive. He seemed to accept the space as it was, neither threatened nor overly curious. Caleb continued his inspection. The floor was stone as well, uneven but intentional, sloped slightly toward a shallow channel near the wall. Drainage, he realized. A narrow shelf ran along one side, built directly into the stone, its surface worn smooth. No clutter, no debris. Nothing that suggested panic or abandonment. Near the far wall, Caleb noticed a shallow alcove, empty now except for dust, but shaped to hold supplies. Everything about the place spoke of long-term use, of someone who had not been passing through, but had chosen to remain. Halfway through the room, Hawk suddenly stood, not sharply, not alarmed. He simply rose and moved to one corner, head tilting slightly as he studied the stone there. His nose hovered inches from the wall, breath slow and deliberate. He shifted, paws adjusting, then pressed his shoulder lightly against the stone. Caleb watched, heart rate ticking up despite himself. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. Hawk pawed once at the ground near the wall, then looked back at Caleb, eyes intent. Caleb crouched, running his fingers along the stone. At first, he felt nothing. Then, subtle but undeniable, a slight give, a seam hidden beneath layers of dust and time. He pressed harder. The stone shifted inward a fraction, releasing a faint click. Caleb froze. He looked at Hawk, who sat back on his haunches, watching calmly. Carefully, Caleb worked the edge of the stone, easing it aside. Behind it lay a narrow recess, dry and sealed. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, were objects that stopped him cold. A small metal case, a bundle of papers tied with twine, and resting on top, unmistakable even beneath years of dust, a military insignia from a war long before his own. Caleb did not touch it. He leaned back on his heels, breath slow, deliberate. The weight of the discovery settled over him, not as excitement, but as gravity. This place had not only been built to endure the land, it had been built to hold something back, to wait. Hawk moved closer and lay down beside him, his flank pressed lightly against Caleb's knee. The dog's presence was steady, grounding, as if to say that this too was part of the terrain now. Caleb replaced the stone carefully, sealing the recess as he had found it. Whatever lay behind it was not meant to be disturbed yet, not without understanding. As the light outside faded further, Caleb realized how late it had grown. The basin was already filling with shadow, the sky above narrowing to a band of muted color. He moved with practiced efficiency, setting up a minimal camp inside the cabin. The stove was cold, but intact. The space held warmth better than he had expected, the stone absorbing what little heat remained from the day. When he finally sat, back against the wall, Hawk at his side, Caleb let himself breathe. He thought of Maggie, of her letter, of the way Hawk had led him here, without hesitation. The pieces did not yet form a clear picture, but they were no longer scattered. They were gathering. Outside, the wind passed over the basin without entering, slipping around the stone walls as if respecting an old agreement. Caleb closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. Whatever this place was, it had not been built for escape. It had been built to stay. And now, so had he. The storm arrived without ceremony. There was no gradual warning, no long build of thunder. The wind simply returned, harder than before, pressing against the stone walls of the cabin as if testing them. Caleb woke to the sound of it moving overhead, not striking directly, but flowing, circling the basin, sliding along the rock, searching for weakness. The air inside the cabin remained still, cool, and dry, the stone holding fast as it had been designed to do. Hawk was awake. The German shepherd lay near the center of the room, his body angled toward the far corner where the floor met the wall. He did not pace or whine. He did not respond to the wind. His ears were upright, but not rigid, and his eyes tracked something that did not move. He had positioned himself there deliberately, as if that exact patch of stone mattered. Caleb sat up slowly, joints stiff from the day's travel. He followed Hawk's gaze and felt the faintest ripple of unease. Not fear, but attention sharpening. Hawk had not behaved this way earlier. Whatever had drawn his focus now had not been present before the storm. "You hear something?" Caleb asked quietly. Hawk did not look at him. The wind strengthened, driving grit against the exterior walls in a steady hiss. Caleb rose and moved closer to the corner. Hawk watched so intently. The floor stones there looked no different from the rest, smooth in places, rough in others, worn by time. He knelt and ran his hand along the seam where floor met wall. Nothing obvious. No draft. No sound. Hawk stood and took 2 careful steps forward, then lowered himself again, this time closer to the wall. His chest pressed against the stone, his head resting near the floor. He exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if settling into a decision rather than a posture. Caleb felt the weight of it then. Hawk was not guarding. He was marking. The realization shifted something in Caleb's chest. He removed his gloves and pressed his palm flat against the stone. He moved it inch by inch, feeling for differences too small to see. When his fingers reached a particular slab, he paused. The stone was warmer. Not by much. Enough. He leaned his weight into it. There was a muted click, almost lost beneath the wind, and the stone shifted inward a fraction. Caleb stilled. He glanced at Hawk, whose eyes had never left the spot. The dog's tail gave one slow sweep against the floor. Not excitement, not anxiety. Confirmation. Carefully, Caleb worked the edge of the slab, easing it free without force. The stone slid aside to reveal a narrow cavity beneath the floor, sealed tight and untouched by moisture. The air that rose from it was dry and faintly metallic, carrying the scent of old paper and time. Inside lay no weapons. Instead, there were objects arranged with care. A small wooden box, its surface darkened by age but intact. A stack of folded papers tied with twine, and resting atop them, catching what little light filtered through the room, a military medal dulled to a soft gray. Caleb's breath slowed. He recognized the insignia immediately. World War II. Infantry. The medal was worn smooth along the edges, the way it got when handled often, not displayed. This had not been a trophy. It had been carried. He lifted the box first, hands steady. Inside were personal effects. Nothing of material value, everything of human weight. A tarnished pocket watch, that no longer ticked. A photograph creased down the center, showing a young man in uniform beside a woman whose expression hovered somewhere between resolve and exhaustion. Their faces were unfamiliar, but the look in the man's eyes was not. Caleb set the box aside and turned to the papers. The handwriting was tight, deliberate, slanted slightly to the right. The ink had faded, but held. These were not letters meant for anyone else. They were records, observations, notes written by someone who understood that memory alone could not be trusted to survive long stretches of isolation. The first page described wind patterns, not poetic descriptions, measurements, angles, times of day when the pressure shifted. The next page detailed modifications to the cabin, changes to the stove's placement, adjustments to the roofline, stone added to one wall to counter prevailing gusts. It was written by a man who learned through repetition and corrected through failure. Caleb felt a quiet pull behind his ribs, the same one he felt when reading after-action reports from missions long past. This was a familiar language, not military jargon, but the mindset beneath it. Midway through the stack, the tone changed. The entries grew shorter. The handwriting tightened further. There were references to illness, not named, just noted. Fatigue, fever, days lost to weakness. A mention of someone else, unnamed, but constant. She is resting today. She did not eat. The wind stayed low. That helped. Caleb stopped reading. The storm outside surged, then fell back, its rhythm pressing against the stone like a breath held too long. Hawk rose and moved closer, his shoulder touching Caleb's leg. The contact was light, grounding. The dog's presence anchored Caleb in the room, in the present, as the past unfolded in his hands. At the bottom of one page, a line had been carved rather than written, the pen pressing so hard it scored the paper. If this holds, it will be enough. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He understood then that the man who built this cabin had not been hiding. He had been staying, choosing stillness not as surrender, but as strategy. He had not prepared to escape the land, but to endure it, even as the world beyond moved on without him. Caleb looked at Hawk. "You knew," he said softly. Hawk did not respond in any way that could be mistaken for understanding. He simply sat, steady and present, eyes reflecting the low light. His role had never been to explain, only to lead. The storm reached its peak then, a sudden violent rush that rattled the door and sent dust drifting from the ceiling. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Caleb felt the vibration through the stone, through his bones. He imagined the man who had once sat here, listening to the same sound, trusting the same walls. The wind passed, not entirely gone, but diminished. The silence that followed was deep, almost reverent. Caleb replaced the papers carefully, aligning the edges, retying the twine with deliberate care. He returned the box and the metal to the cavity and slid the stone back into place until the seam vanished once more into the floor. Whatever had been hidden there had not been meant for discovery by chance. It had waited, and now it could wait longer. Hawk lay down beside the sealed stone, his body relaxed for the first time since the storm began. His breathing slowed, evened. The task he had carried without knowing the name of was complete. Caleb leaned back against the wall, exhaustion settling into his muscles. He felt no urge to take what he had found, no temptation. The weight of it demanded something else: attention, respect, patience. Outside, the wind moved on, leaving the basin intact. Inside, a different kind of memory had surfaced. Not one that belonged to Caleb, but one he now carried. And Hawk, faithful to instincts older than language, had known exactly where to stand. Morning arrived cautiously, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Light seeped into the basin in narrow bands, slipping over the rim of stone and settling gently against the cabin walls. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind an air so still it felt deliberate. Caleb woke, seated against the stone wall, his back stiff, his legs heavy, but his mind clear in a way he had not felt for years. Hawk lay beside him, stretched on his side, chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. The German shepherd's coat, dusted faintly with sand, caught the pale light, black and tan softened by the quiet of morning. For a long moment, Caleb did not move. The events of the night replayed without urgency. The hidden cavity, the papers, the metal. None of it pressed at him now. Instead, it rested, settled into place like something that had been waiting to be acknowledged rather than acted upon. He placed a hand on the stone floor near where the cavity lay hidden once more. The surface was cool, unchanged, giving nothing away. Hawk stirred and lifted his head, eyes half-lidded but alert. He did not rise. He simply watched Caleb, reading him the way he always did. "I know," Caleb murmured quietly. "We'll take it slow." Hawk's tail thumped once against the floor. Agreement, or acceptance. Caleb had learned not to overinterpret. As Caleb stood and stretched, a memory surfaced unbidden, carried in by the stillness. Maggie's voice, calm and matter-of-fact, telling him about the desert years ago. They had been sitting at her kitchen table, the surface worn smooth by decades of use. She had been trimming herbs, hands steady despite the slight tremor in her fingers. Her hair, once dark, had gone fully silver by then, worn loose around her shoulders. Her skin was lined, sun-browned, the face of a woman who had lived outdoors more often than in. "There are places that don't forget," she had said, not looking at him. "People do, but the land doesn't always." She had spoken of a man, never named, who had gone west during the war and never come back. Family rumor said he'd vanished somewhere beyond the mapped roads, swallowed by heat and distance. No grave, no record, just absence. Maggie had not spoken with sadness so much as certainty, as if disappearance did not mean erasure. Caleb opened his eyes. The cabin fit those fragments too well to ignore. The construction, the precision, the care. It aligned with the way Maggie spoke of that missing relative, not as reckless, but deliberate. A man who made decisions slowly and lived with them fully. Caleb moved toward the stove. The metal was cold to the touch, its surface darkened by age, but free of rust. He knelt and examined it more closely, recalling the markings carved into the stone walls nearby. Hawk rose and followed, sitting a short distance away, watching without interference. The stove's placement, slightly off-center, made sense now. The flue angled just enough to draw air without creating backflow. Whoever had built this had understood wind not as an enemy, but as a force to be redirected. Caleb adjusted the intake vent according to the carved notes. He did it carefully, deliberately, following the logic rather than improvising. He gathered a small stack of kindling from his pack, then paused, glancing once at the wall markings again. "You trusted this," he said under his breath. "Let's see if you were right." He struck the flame. At first, the fire hesitated, the kindling catching unevenly. Smoke curled upward, thin and uncertain. Caleb resisted the instinct to interfere immediately. He waited, adjusted the vent by a fraction. The smoke shifted, then pulled cleanly into the flue. The fire settled, growing steady, controlled. Warmth began to spread. Not the aggressive heat of a blaze, but a slow, even presence that filled the cabin without demanding attention. The stone absorbed it, held it, returned it in kind. Caleb exhaled, shoulders dropping as something inside him loosened. Hawk rose and approached the stove, stopping just far enough back to avoid the heat. He sat, ears relaxed, eyes half closed. the tension that had lived in his body since the storm finally released. The cabin responded. That was the thought that struck Caleb most clearly, not that the fire worked, but that the place itself seemed to accept it, as if the structure recognized the sequence. The order of actions followed as they had been intended. Caleb leaned back against the wall, letting the warmth seep into muscles that had been tight for too long. The familiar urge to keep moving, to avoid stillness, did not surface. He waited for it. It never came. Instead, there was quiet. Not the oppressive silence that haunted him at night, but something broader. A sense of containment, of being held by space rather than trapped within it. He had lived years avoiding this exact feeling, mistaking it for danger when it was, in fact, rest. Halfway through the morning, Hawk rose again. This time, his movement was different. He walked toward the door, stopped, and looked back at Caleb. His ears tilted forward, his expression attentive rather than urgent. Caleb followed him outside. The basin lay unchanged, stone walls catching the growing light, shadows retreating inch by inch. But something new marked the ground near the cabin's edge, a set of shallow impressions in the sand. Old, nearly erased, but still visible now that the storm had stripped away loose debris. Boot prints, not Caleb's, not recent, narrower, older. They led away from the cabin, curving toward the far end of the basin before disappearing beneath windswept stone. Caleb crouched, tracing the edge of one print with his finger. The tread pattern was unfamiliar, outdated. He felt a tightening behind his eyes, not grief, but recognition. He left on foot, Caleb said quietly. Hawk stood beside him, gaze following the faint trail. He did not move to follow. He had already completed that part of the work. The moment lingered, heavy with implication. Whoever had lived here had not died inside these walls. He had survived long enough to leave them behind. The cabin had not been a tomb. It had been a pause. Caleb straightened slowly. The thought shifted something fundamental. Survival did not always end in tragedy. Sometimes it ended in movement, even if that movement went unrecorded. They returned inside as the air warmed further. Caleb added another piece of wood to the stove, adjusting the vent without looking. The fire responded immediately, steady as before. He thought again of Maggie, of her quiet certainty, of the way she had said that memory did not die simply because it went missing. For the first time in years, Caleb felt no urgency to leave, no need to outrun the feeling settling into his chest. The cabin did not demand answers. It offered presence. Hawk lay down near the stove, content. Caleb sat beside him, back against the stone, letting the warmth and the quiet do their work. Whatever Maggie had remembered had not been wrong. It had simply been waiting. Morning did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, light creeping across the basin in cautious increments, as if the land itself were reluctant to disturb what had settled there overnight. Caleb woke before Hawk, a rarity. He sat still for several minutes, listening to the quiet inside the cabin, the stove's warmth lingering in the stone like a held breath. Hawk eventually stirred, lifting his head and blinking once, then twice. His posture was relaxed now, the taut vigilance of the previous days replaced by something closer to equilibrium. Whatever task had driven him so insistently had loosened its grip. Caleb rose and moved toward the section of floor where the hidden cavity lay sealed. He did not rush. There was no urgency in him now, only clarity. He removed the stone carefully, setting it aside exactly as before, and reached into the recess. This time, the contents went deeper than the items he had already seen. Beneath the box and the papers lay a second layer, wrapped more tightly and protected by oilcloth that crackled softly when he touched it. Inside were things that shifted the weight of the discovery entirely. A small stack of old currency, folded with precision. Deeds and land papers, edges worn but intact. Legal documents bearing dates and signatures. None of them filed. None of them finalized. This was not a cache forgotten in desperation. This was preparation. Caleb sat back on his heels, the realization settling slowly. The man who had built the cabin had not planned to die there. He had planned for a future beyond it. These were safeguards, not relics. Assets held in reserve, protected against theft, weather, and time, waiting for a moment that never came. Hawk approached and sat beside him, close enough that Caleb could feel the dog's warmth against his leg. The German shepherd did not sniff the contents or show interest. He looked away, gaze drifting toward the open doorway instead, as if signaling where attention belonged. Caleb understood. He replaced the items exactly as he had found them, layer by layer, sealing the cavity with the same care it had been built with. When the stone slid back into place, the seam disappeared completely. The floor returned to anonymity, holding its secret without complaint. "These stay," Caleb said quietly. Hawk's ears flicked once. He did not object. He did not affirm. He simply accepted the boundary. They left the cabin an hour later. Caleb took only what had been meant to travel: letters, notes, and the hand-drawn plans folded carefully into a weatherproof sleeve. The metal and personal effects remained where they were. The cabin did not feel diminished by their absence. If anything, it seemed steadier, relieved of the need to explain itself. The drive out of the basin took longer than the way in. The storm had altered the land, softening some paths and erasing others. Caleb moved slowly, reading the terrain with renewed attention. Hawk watched from the back, head turning occasionally, but without urgency. The land no longer resisted them. By late afternoon, they reached the paved road and followed it west toward the town where Maggie had once worked. The Historical Society sat on the edge of town, a low, rectangular building of pale brick, its sign modest and sun-faded. It did not announce importance. It simply endured. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old wood. The woman at the front desk looked up as they entered. She was in her early 60s, medium height, with close-cropped gray hair and wire-framed glasses perched low on her nose. Her posture was upright, her expression attentive without being intrusive. This was someone accustomed to listening more than speaking. "Can I help you?" she asked. Caleb nodded once. "I'm looking for records," he said. "Something that never made it into the system." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, curiosity sparking. Hawk sat at Caleb's side, calm and composed. The woman glanced at him, then smiled faintly. "He's well trained," she said. "He listens," Caleb replied. She introduced herself as Eleanor Price, the Society's current archivist. Her voice was steady, her manner direct. She led them to a small consultation room lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of local history. Ledgers, photographs, boxes labeled in careful handwriting. Caleb laid the documents on the table and began to unfold them one by one. Eleanor leaned in, adjusting her glasses, her expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention. "These are..." She stopped, scanning a date. "These are older than most of our frontier records." She turned a page, then another. Her movements slowed. "Where did you find these?" she asked. "In the desert," Caleb said simply. She did not press him for more. Eleanor rose and stepped out briefly, returning moments later with another man. He was tall and spare, with a narrow face and a beard that had gone fully white without thinning. His clothes were practical, his movements economical. When he introduced himself as Thomas Hale, a volunteer historian, his handshake was firm, his eyes sharp. They studied the documents together, murmuring quietly, comparing notes. The plans drew particular attention. Thomas traced the lines with a finger, nodding slowly. "This isn't improvised," he said. "This is a system. Whoever designed it understood airflow, thermal mass, structural load. That kind of thinking wasn't common out here at the time. Halfway through the review, Hawk stood. The movement was subtle, but immediate. He crossed the room and stopped near a framed photograph on the wall. It showed a group of men standing beside a half-built structure, faces indistinct, their clothes dusted with pale stone. Hawk sat. Eleanor followed his gaze and inhaled sharply. "That's him," she said softly. She stepped closer, lifting the frame from the wall. "We've never been able to confirm his fate. Disappeared during the war years. Family assumed he was lost." Caleb felt the air tighten around them. The photograph showed a man standing slightly apart from the others, posture straight, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the camera. There was something familiar in the way he stood, not his face, his bearing. "That structure behind them," Thomas said quietly. "It matches these plans." Silence filled the room. Eleanor looked at Caleb, something like gratitude in her eyes. "You didn't take everything," she said. It was not a question. "No," Caleb replied. "Some things weren't meant to move." She nodded, understanding immediately. They spent the next hour verifying dates, cross-referencing names, assembling fragments into coherence. The conclusion formed not as a revelation, but as a confirmation. The cabin was real, the system intact. The man who built it had not vanished without purpose. He had lived, he had planned, and something had interrupted the plan, not through failure, but through circumstance. As the sun dipped lower outside, Eleanor gathered the documents carefully. "This needs to be handled properly," she said. "Surveyed, documented, preserved." Caleb stood. "That's why I'm here," he said. Hawk returned to his side, posture easy, as if a weight had finally been set down. Caleb glanced once toward the window, toward the direction of the basin beyond the town. He felt no pull to return immediately. The cabin had waited long enough. Now, its story had begun to move. Caleb met Maggie on a quiet afternoon, the kind that carried no urgency and asked for none in return. Her house stood where the mountains began to soften into foothills, a low structure built of timber and stone, its porch worn smooth by time and use. The place suited her. It had never been grand, but it had endured. Maggie opened the door before Caleb could knock. She was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he was only noticing now how age had refined her presence rather than diminished it. Her hair, once silver and loose, was braided neatly and draped over one shoulder. Her frame was lean, her posture slightly bent but unbowed, as if time had curved her gently instead of breaking her. Her eyes, sharp and dark beneath the lines of her face, took Caleb in at once, then moved to Hawk with unmistakable affection. "You came," she said simply. Caleb nodded. He did not trust himself to say more. Hawk stepped forward, tail wagging once, controlled and respectful. Maggie knelt with effort, one hand braced against her knee, the other resting on Hawk's broad head. The dog leaned into her touch, eyes soft, as if recognizing not just a person, but a familiar gravity. "You've been working," she murmured to Hawk. "I can see it." Inside, the house smelled of dried herbs and old books. Maggie led Caleb to the kitchen table, its surface scarred by decades of use. She poured tea with steady hands, the ritual unhurried. Caleb laid the folded plans and letters out between them, smoothing them carefully as if they were fragile in ways paper alone could not explain. Maggie studied the drawings in silence. Her fingers traced the lines lightly, not reading so much as remembering. She did not ask where they came from. She did not ask how Caleb had found them. She did not ask what he intended to do next. Instead, she exhaled. "That's his work," she said at last. Caleb looked up. "You're sure?" Maggie nodded. "He built things the way he lived. Low, solid, meant to last without asking for attention." She paused, eyes lingering on one particular notation. He said once that if a place couldn't survive without him, it wasn't worth building. She leaned back, gaze drifting toward the window where the mountains rose in quiet layers beyond the glass. They told us he was lost, but I knew better. Lost people leave traces. He left intention. Caleb felt something settle in his chest, a tension he had carried without naming, now easing into place. They did not speak of the past at length. There was no need. Maggie had lived with the unanswered questions long enough to recognize when answers arrived. Caleb, for his part, understood that not every story needed to be told aloud to be honored. Hawk lay near the hearth, breathing slow. His muzzle had gone lighter around the edges, the black fading into gray, in a way Caleb had tried not to notice. His movements were still strong, still controlled, but there were pauses now where there had not been before. Small hesitations, longer rests. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Hawk rose with effort and crossed the room, settling near the door. He did not whine or pace. He simply stood there, looking out. Caleb noticed. He joined him, hand resting briefly on Hawk's broad back. The dog leaned into the contact, then shifted his weight as if adjusting to a new balance. "You're telling me something," Caleb said quietly. Hawk did not respond in the way humans expected answers. He did not need to. The days that followed unfolded without announcement. Caleb remained in the mountains longer than he had planned. Then longer still. He helped Maggie with small repairs, moving carefully through tasks that did not demand urgency. Word spread quietly that he knew the land, that he could read weather and terrain with uncommon accuracy. When a hiker went missing, Caleb joined the search without ceremony. Hawk followed, steady and focused, his instincts still sharp, even as his pace slowed. People noticed. A ranger named Daniel Ortiz approached him one afternoon. Daniel was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered beyond his years by sun and responsibility. His beard was trimmed short, his eyes alert but kind. He spoke plainly, without authority he hadn't earned. "You've got away with this terrain," Daniel said. "And with that dog. We could use someone like you, part-time if you want it." Caleb considered the offer longer than he needed to. The work was familiar in shape, if not in name. Assessing risk, guiding others through uncertainty, making decisions that mattered. The difference was what followed. No extraction, no redeployment, no next objective, pulling him away before the weight of one could settle. "I don't move as fast as I used to," Caleb said. Daniel glanced at Hawk, then smiled. "Neither do most of the people we're trying to bring home." Caleb accepted. The work grounded him. Search and rescue demanded patience more than strength, attention more than aggression. Caleb found that the skills he had honed in conflict translated cleanly into care. Hawk accompanied him when he could, working shorter stretches, resting when needed. When Hawk stayed behind, Caleb felt the absence keenly, but without panic. Trust had replaced urgency. One afternoon, while surveying a ridge after a minor rock slide, Hawk stopped. Not abruptly, not with alarm. He simply stood, nose lifted, ears angled toward the wind. Caleb watched him, heart tightening with a familiar awareness. For a moment, he wondered if this was another turning point, another signal. Hawk sat. He did not move again. Caleb understood then, not as loss, but as completion. The need to lead had eased. The path had been shown. What remained was presence. Time passed differently after that. Hawk aged with dignity, his steps slower, his rests longer. He still greeted Caleb every morning with quiet certainty, still watched the world with interest rather than suspicion. The mountains accepted him as they had accepted the cabin, without demand, without hurry. Caleb remained. He guided strangers through storms and darkness, taught them how to listen to land that spoke softly, He told no one about the cabin's location unless it mattered. Some things were meant to be preserved through discretion rather than display. When the Historical Society began formal preservation efforts, Caleb assisted without stepping into the spotlight. He watched as others documented, measured, recorded. The cabin did not resist. It had waited long enough. On a clear evening, months later, Caleb returned to Maggie's porch with Hawk at his side. The sun sank behind the peaks, painting the stone in muted gold. Maggie sat beside him, hands folded, gaze steady. "You stayed," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied. She smiled, satisfied. "Good. Some missions don't ask you to move. They ask you to remain." Hawk lay at Caleb's feet, eyes closed, breathing even. The world did not mark the moment with ceremony. No applause, no recognition. But something essential had shifted. A man who had spent his life moving had learned the discipline of stillness. A dog who had led with instinct had brought his human to the end of a necessary path. A house built to wait had finally been heard. Caleb watched the last light fade from the mountains and felt no pull to follow it. For the first time, staying felt like progress. Sometimes the miracles we are waiting for do not arrive as sudden light or dramatic rescue. They come as guidance that feels ordinary at first. A door that holds through the storm. A presence that leads us when we cannot see the way. A moment of stillness that turns out to be exactly where we were meant to stand. Perhaps God does not always change our circumstances. Perhaps He changes our direction, or our pace, or teaches us when to move and when to remain. In our daily lives, we often rush past these quiet signs. We mistake patience for delay and stillness for failure. Yet faith reminds us that nothing built with care is ever wasted, and nothing placed in God's hands is ever forgotten. If this story spoke to you, consider sharing it with someone who may need a reminder that they are not alone on their path. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, or what part of this story touched your heart. And if you find comfort in stories of quiet strength, faithful hearts, and the bond between humans and animals, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and grant you peace in both movement and rest. And may you recognize the small miracles already walking beside you today.